Okay, let's unpack this fascinating topic. We're diving deep today into something that, seems pretty straightforward, a basic B vitamin.
Right.
But it turns out it has this surprisingly complex, almost paradoxical relationship with our health, especially when we start talking about cancer risk.
Absolutely.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into folate and its synthetic cousin, folic acid, using the sources you've provided. Our mission, well, it's really to cut through some of the noise and help you quickly grasp the core ideas, those surprising nuances, and figure out what the science actually says about these two forms and their potential link to cancer.
Yeah, and it's definitely not a simple story like folate good, folic acid bad, or the other way around.
Yeah.
This deep dive really shows there are layers involving basic metabolic differences, specific genetic variations that can matter quite a bit.
Okay.
And critically, the dose you're actually getting, it's a great example of how nutrition science is rarely just black and white.
So let's start right at the beginning. What exactly is folate and how is folic acid different?
Okay, so folate itself is a B vitamin. It's essential for some really fundamental processes happening constantly in your body.
Like what?
Things like making and repairing DNA, the blueprint for your cells, and also a process called methylation, which is vital for regulating genes, protein function, all sorts of things.
And you find this naturally.
Exactly. Natural folate is in foods like dark leafy greens, legumes, asparagus, liver, those sorts of things.
Right.
Folic acid, on the other hand, that's the man-made version. It's chemically stable, which is why it's great for fortifying foods like breads and cereals in many countries, and it's what you usually find in supplements.
So they do the same job, basically, but one's from food, the other's added.
They support the same pathways, yes.
Yeah.
But, and this is key, they behave quite differently once you actually consume them. Their metabolic journey is distinct.
Okay, tell us about that journey. What happens when your body processes natural folate versus the synthetic stuff?
So natural folate from food, it's already in what's called a reduced form. Your body finds it relatively easy to convert it into the active form that your cells can actually use.
The active form.
Yeah, that's 5-methyl hydrofolate, or just methylfolate for short. That's the goal.
Got it.
Now, synthetic folic acid, it's different. Your body has to put it through a multi-step conversion process. It needs specific enzymes to turn that folic acid into the usable methylfolate.
And this conversion, this is where it gets particularly interesting, right? Because there's an enzyme involved where people can have genetic differences.
Precisely. There's one main enzyme that does a key part of this conversion, and it's called MTHFR.
MTHFR.
Stands for methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. And this enzyme, it's considered weight limiting.
Eating it sets the speed limit for the conversion.
Exactly. It controls how fast that folic acid gets turned into methylfolate. And there's a really common genetic variation, a polymorphism in the MTHFR gene, specifically the C677T1.
Polymorphism, just a common variation in the gene's code.
That's exactly it. A common difference in the DNA sequence for MTHFR. And if you happen to inherit 2 copies of the T version, we call that the TT genotype, your MTHFR enzyme just doesn't work as efficiently. Its activity is significantly reduced compared to someone with the more common CC genotype.
Okay. So if you have that TT type, your body is slower at converting the synthetic folic acid.
That's the consequence, yeah. This reduced efficiency can mean, well, 2 things, potentially. One, some unmetabolized folic acid might start to build up in your bloodstream because your body just can't process it quickly enough.
Right.
And 2, at the same time, you might end up with lower levels of the active methylfolate actually reaching your tissues where it's needed for things like DNA repair.
Which could be a problem.
It could. And this whole finding is a big reason why researchers and supplement companies, too, have started asking, could supplementing directly with methylfolate, the active form, be better? Especially for people with this MTHFR variation, because it just bypasses that slow enzyme step completely.
That makes a lot of sense, mechanistically anyway.
Yeah.
So we've got the different forms, the different processing, the genetic influence, which brings us to this central puzzle the sources talk about, the folate paradox.
Right, the paradox. Because on one hand, folate is absolutely essential for healthy cells. It helps make and repair DNA, which directly helps prevent the kinds of mutations that can lead to cancer. That's its protective role.
Okay, the good side.
The good side. But UNIT, and here's the twist, what do cancer cells do? They divide rapidly, uncontrollably. And what do all dividing cells need fuel for? Making new DNA. And folate is crucial for that.
Yeah. So if you already have some potentially cancerous cells hanging around, Giving them lots of folate might actually help them grow.
That's the implication, yes. If precancerous cells or maybe a tiny undetected tumor already exist, suddenly having a high availability of folate might give them the fuel they need to divide faster, to progress.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. This dual nature creates the paradox. Too little folate might compromise your DNA stability and increase the risk of cancer starting in the first place initiation. But too much folate, especially maybe the readily available synthetic form, could potentially accelerate cancer progression if it's already there.
Which leads to that U-shaped curve idea you mentioned.
Precisely. Scientists often talk about a U-shaped relationship with cancer risk, meaning both deficiency and potential excess could increase risk, but it depends on the context, like whether cancer has already started or not.
That U-shaped curve really helps visualize the complexity. Let's look at what the actual studies say, because dose seems absolutely critical here. What about moderate folic acid supplementation, say the 400 to 800 micrograms you often see in multivitamins?
Right. Well, most of the really large clinical trials and these big meta-analyses that pool data together, when they look at those moderate doses, they generally find it appears safe for most people regarding overall cancer risk. One very large meta-analysis, combining data from 13 trials, nearly 50,000 people, reported no statistically significant impact on total cancer incidence.
No impact.
Well, they calculated a relative risk of 1.05. Relative risk just compares the likelihood of something happening in one group versus another. 1.0 means no difference. So 1.05 is very close, not statistically significant.
I see.
And specifically for colorectal cancer, looking at 7 trials, the relative risk was 1.01. Again, basically bang on 1.0, suggesting no significant increase in risk compared to the placebo groups in those big studies.
Okay, so moderate doses look, well, pretty reassuring based on that large chunk of evidence.
Broadly speaking, yes. The bulk of the evidence at those moderate levels hasn't shown a big widespread increase in overall cancer risk in the population studied in those trials. But, and it's important to note this, the sources do mention that the findings aren't perfectly consistent across every single analysis. There was one meta-analysis that did report a slightly higher incidence of cancer in the supplemented groups. They found a relative risk of 1.21.
1.21. So about a 21% higher rate in that particular analysis.
In that analysis, yes. It just highlights that the science maybe isn't completely settled for every single context, and it does emphasize we need more long-term data, perhaps looking into specific subgroups or different cancer types more closely.
That slight inconsistency is definitely worth noting. But then the sources shift focus to high-dose use, often defined as 1 milligram, so 1,000 micrograms or more per day. Is this where more specific concerns start cropping up?
This is where some of the more recent research and some specific findings detail in your sources do seem to raise more flags, particularly when looking at certain groups or situations. Well, high-dose folic acid has been associated with an increased overall cancer risk in some studies, looking specifically at women who have given birth. There's also a pretty consistent association mentioned with non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Really?
Yeah, and interestingly, that link was seen even in studies of women with epilepsy who are often prescribed high-dose folic acid because some anti-seizure meds can interfere with folate metabolism.
Okay, and there was a particularly striking finding in the sources about prenatal exposure, wasn't there? High-dose folic acid during pregnancy.
Yes, this was quite concerning. It came from studies following children born to mothers with epilepsy. As I mentioned, these mothers are often given high doses of folic acid to prevent neural tube defects, which their medication can increase the risk of.
Right.
But when researchers looked at the long-term health of their children, prenatal exposure to that high-dose folic acid was linked to a significantly increased risk of childhood cancer later on.
How significant?
The sources quoted specific numbers incidence rates. That's how many new cases pop up in a population over time. For the children exposed to high-dose folic acid in pregnancy, the rate was 42.5 cases per 100,000 person years.
Person years. Remind us what that means.
It's just a way to measure the total time everyone in this study was followed. So 100,000 person years could be 10,000 people followed for 10 years, or 100,000 for 1 year. It standardizes it. So 42.5 new cases per 100,000 person years in the exposed group.
Okay, 42.5.
Yeah.
And what was it in the unexposed group? The kids whose mothers with epilepsy didn't get the high dose.
In that group, the rate was 18.4 per 100,000 person years.
Wow. So more than double the rate in the group exposed to high-dose folic acid prenatally.
It is. Now, it's really crucial to remember this is a specific finding in a specific context, children of mothers with epilepsy, but it's findings like these that definitely fuel broader scientific questions about the safety of sustained high-dose intake over the very long term for anyone. Questions that maybe weren't fully answered by those earlier shorter trials on moderate doses.